The wind didn't just blow through Ironwood Ridge. It screamed, tearing at the pine trees like a wild beast starving for a kill. In the high country of 1880s Montana, a man didn't die from a bullet half as often as he died from the cold. And that night, the cold was a living thing. Silas Blackwood thought he had seen everything the mountain could throw at a man. He was a ghost in these woods, a man who had traded the warmth of society for the brutal honesty of the ice. But when he saw the impossible, a splash of crimson silk half buried in a snowdrift, miles from the nearest town, he froze. It wasn't just a body. It was a woman. And she was still breathing. What Silas didn't know, as he slung his rifle and moved toward her, was that saving her life would force him to confront the one thing he had been running from for 10 years, his own heart. Stay with me, folks. This is the story of a man who thought he was empty, and the woman who showed him he was just waiting to be filled. This is your narrator, Marcus, from Frontier Rescue Stories. If you love tales of the Old West, of survival, redemption, rugged justice, and romance that blooms against all odds, you have come to the right place. Before we dive into this journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video, and smash subscribe. Your support helps us stir up the algorithm and bring these campfire tales to a larger audience. Also, I love hearing from you, so drop a comment down below and let me know which part of the world you are tuning in from today. Silas Blackwood was a man carved from granite and regret. His beard was thick, peppered with the gray of hard winters, and his eyes were the color of a frozen lake, clear, sharp, and utterly devoid of warmth. He lived his life by a simple code: take only what you need, speak only when necessary, and never trust a sky that looks too blue, because a storm is always waiting behind the ridge. On this particular Tuesday, the storm wasn't waiting. It had already arrived. The blizzard had descended upon the Bitterroot Mountains with a ferocity that would have sent wolves scurrying for their dens. But Silas was out checking his trap lines. He needed the pelts. The winter had been lean, and the flour sack in his cabin was looking dangerously light. He moved through the knee-deep powder with the practiced ease of a man who had walked these trails for a decade. His snowshoes crunched rhythmically, a dull thwack hiss that was the only sound in a white, muffled world. He was miles from civilization. The nearest settlement, a rough-and-tumble mining camp called Echo Creek, was a 3-day ride to the east, and in this weather, it might as well have been on the moon. That was why, when he saw the color, his mind refused to accept it. Red, bright, vibrant crimson. It stood out against the blinding white of the snow like a fresh wound. Silas stopped dead. He squinted against the biting wind, wiping ice from his eyelashes. It looked like a bundle of cloth dropped by a careless traveler. But no traveler came this high up Ironwood Ridge. Not in November, not ever. He unslung his Winchester rifle, a reflex born of caution, and approached slowly. The wind howled, whipping snow into a frenzy around him. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a bundle of supplies. It was a person. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight ball, half buried by the drifting snow. She was wearing a coat that might have been fashionable in Boston or New York, fine wool, dyed a deep red with delicate stitching. But out here, it was nothing more than a shroud. It was too thin, far too elegant for the savage reality of the frontier. Her hair, dark as a raven's wing, was matted with ice crystals, plastered across a face that was terrifyingly pale. Silas knelt beside her, his large, rough hands hesitating for a fraction of a second. He had found bodies on this mountain before, prospectors who got greedy, drifters who got lost. They were always frozen solid, statues of their own foolishness. He expected the same hardness here. He reached out and touched her neck, searching for a pulse beneath the icy skin. There, faint thread, a fluttering bird trapped in a cage. Alive, he grunted, the sound of his own voice startling him. He hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. He pushed it down. Panic killed you out here. Action saved you. He needed to move her, and he needed to do it now. If he left her here for another 10 minutes, that faint flutter would stop, and she would be just another ghost of the mountain. He quickly brushed the snow off her back. She was small, fragile beneath the layers of wet wool. He carefully scooped her up. She was dead weight, limp and freezing, her head lolled back, resting against his shoulder. He felt the terrifying chill radiating off her body. She was like a block of ice. Easy now, he muttered, though she couldn't hear him. I got you. The journey back to his cabin was a nightmare. The wind, seemingly angered that he was stealing its prize, doubled its force. It slammed into Silas, trying to knock him off balance. Every step was a battle. His lungs burned with the cold air, and his legs screamed in protest under the added weight. He held her tight against his chest, trying to share what little body heat he had, shielding her face from the biting sleet with his own body. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why a woman dressed for a city. Ball was dying on a mountain peak in the middle of nowhere. Was she running? Was she lost? Had she been left for dead? The questions swirled in his mind, but he shoved them aside. They could wait. Survival came first. The cabin appeared out of the white gloom like a dark, solid anchor. It wasn't much, logs chinked with mud and moss, a low roof heavy with snow, and a stone chimney that promised life. Silas kicked the door open, stumbling inside. The sudden silence of the cabin was jarring. The wind was reduced to a dull roar outside. The air inside was cold, but still. Embers glowed faintly in the hearth from his morning fire. He didn't stop to rest. He laid her on his narrow cot, which was covered in buffalo robes and bear furs. Her skin was blue-tinged, her breathing shallow and ragged. He stripped off his heavy coat and threw it over her, then turned to the fireplace. His hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, shook slightly as he struck a match. He fed birch bark and kindling to the embers, blowing gently until a flame licked up, hungry and bright. He piled on split logs, building the fire up until it roared, casting long and dancing shadows against the log walls. He turned back to the woman. The heat was rising, but it wouldn't be enough if she was in wet clothes. This was the part that made Silas hesitate. He was a man of honor, raised with old-world manners that sat oddly on a mountain recluse. But modesty wouldn't save her from hypothermia. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered to the unconscious woman. With efficient, respectful movements, he removed the sodden red coat. Underneath, her dress was silk, useless, impractical silk. It was torn at the hem and soaked through. He removed her boots. Her feet were small, the skin waxy and pale. Frostbite was setting in. He rubbed them vigorously, trying to force blood back into the extremities. He worked with a desperate focus, stripping away the wet layers and wrapping her immediately in warm, dry wool blankets he pulled from his chest. He boiled water in his cast-iron kettle. He found his stash of dried willow bark and herbs, crushing them into a cup. If she woke up, she would need medicine for the fever that was sure to follow. For hours, Silas didn't sleep. He sat in his rough-hewn rocking chair, his Winchester leaning against his knee, watching her chest rise and fall. The storm raged outside, burying the world in white, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Who was she? And why did the sight of her helpless face make his chest ache with a familiar old pain? He looked at her hands, smooth, uncalloused. She wasn't from here. She was a flower dropped in a furnace. Around midnight she stirred. A low moan escaped her lips. Silas was at her side in an instant, a tin cup of warm broth in his hand. Her eyes fluttered open. They were green, not the dark green of the pines, but the bright, terrified green of spring grass. She looked up at him, a giant of a man, scarred and bearded, looming over her in the firelight, and he saw the scream forming in her throat. "You're safe," he said, his voice essentially a gravelly rumble. He tried to sound gentle, but he was out of practice. "You're at Ironwood Ridge. I found you in the snow." She stared at him, her eyes darting around the rustic cabin, the animal pelts, and the drying herbs hanging from the rafters. She tried to sit up, but collapsed back with a gasp of pain. "Who?" Her voice was a cracked whisper, barely audible. "Who are you?" "Name's Silas," he said, pulling the chair closer. "And you nearly died today, miss. So don't try to move." She looked at him, confusion warring with exhaustion. Then her eyes welled up with tears. He's coming," she whispered, her hand gripping the fur blanket with surprising strength. "He's coming for me." Silas frowned, his brow furrowing. "Who's coming?" But she didn't answer. Her eyes rolled back, and she slipped into the darkness of sleep once more. Silas sat back, his jaw tightening. He looked at the door, barred against the wind. He didn't know who was coming, but as he looked at the fragile woman in his bed, he made a silent vow. Whoever it was, they would have to get through him first. and on Ironwood Ridge, Silas Blackwood was the apex predator. The next 3 days were a blur of fever and firelight. The storm outside refused to break, sealing the cabin in a tomb of snow. Inside, the world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the log cabin and the rhythmic rasp of the stranger's breathing. Silas became a nursemaid, a role that fit him as poorly as a silk suit. He was used to skinning elk and mending fences, not spoon-feeding broth to a delirious woman. Yet his hands, capable of snapping a wolf's neck, were surprisingly tender as he changed the cool rags on her forehead. She drifted in and out of consciousness. In her fever dreams, she spoke. She cried out names Silas didn't know. "Father, please," she would beg. Or sometimes, "The debt is paid. Let me go." Silas listened, piecing together fragments of a shattered life. He learned her name was Eleanor. He learned she came from St. Louis. And he learned she was running from a marriage that sounded more like a prison sentence than a union. By the 4th morning, the fever broke. Silas was outside chopping wood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing in the crisp, cold air. The storm had finally passed, leaving the mountains glistening under a blindingly bright sun. When he walked back inside, stomping the snow off his boots, he found her sitting up. She was clutching the buffalo robe to her chin, her green eyes wide and alert. She looked terrified. Silas froze in the doorway, an armful of firewood in his grasp. "You're awake," he stated, the obvious words hanging heavy in the air. "Where am I?" Eleanor asked, her voice stronger now, though still trembling. And who are you?" He walked over to the hearth and dumped the wood with a loud clatter. She flinched. He mentally cursed himself for being so rough. "I told you. Name's Silas. This is my cabin. You're high in the Bitterroots, miles from anywhere." She looked down at her hands. "I remember. The cold. The horse. My horse ran off." She looked up at him, panic rising again. "How long have I been here?" 4 days, Silas said, moving to the stove to pour coffee. "You were nearly frozen solid when I found you. Had a fever that would have killed a lesser woman." He held out a tin cup. She hesitated, then took it. Her fingers brushed his, her skin soft and pale against his weather-beaten, scarred knuckles. The contact sent a jolt through him he hadn't expected. He pulled back quickly. "Drink," he ordered gruffly. "It's chicory and coffee. Keep you warm." "Thank you," she whispered. She took a sip, grimacing at the bitterness, but she drank it. I don't have any money to pay you." Silas let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Money's no good up here, Miss Eleanor. Bears don't take coin, and neither do I." She froze. "How do you know my name?" "You talk in your sleep," Silas said, sitting in his rocking chair and pulling out his whittling knife. He picked up a piece of cedar and started carving, keeping his eyes on the wood. "You talked about St. Louis, about a man named Barton?" Eleanor went pale. The cup rattled in her hand. You know him?" "Never heard of him," Silas said calmly. "But you sounded like you were scared of him." Eleanor set the cup down on the floor. She pulled her knees up to her chest. "He's a monster," she said, her voice hollow. "My father. He owed Barton money, a lot of gambling debts. Barton offered to forgive the debt if he got me." Silas's knife paused. He didn't look up, but his grip on the handle tightened. "Selling a daughter to cover a bet. That's a low kind of evil." "I ran," Eleanor continued, the words spilling out now that the dam had broken. "I took a horse and rode west. I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted to get away. But I got lost. The snow came so fast." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You saved my life, Silas. Why?" Silas looked up then. His eyes were hard, unreadable. "I don't leave things to die in the snow. Not if I can help it." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. Over the next week, a strange domestic routine formed. Eleanor was weak, but she was determined not to be a burden. As her strength returned, she insisted on helping. It started with small things, sweeping the floor, mending the tear in her coat with Silas's bone needle and sinew. Silas watched her with a mixture of fascination and annoyance. She was out of place here. She washed her face every morning in the basin. She tried to organize his chaotic shelves of supplies. She hummed while she worked, a soft melodic sound that seemed alien in the heavy silence of the cabin. But there was friction too. "You can't just use all the water," Silas snapped one morning when she used the last of the bucket to wash her hair. "Hauling that up from the creek through 3 feet of snow isn't a game." Eleanor flushed, her eyes flashing with a spark of fire he hadn't seen before. "I'm not playing a game, Mr. Blackwood. I'm trying to feel human. I smell like bear grease and smoke. Better to smell like smoke and be alive than smell like roses and be dead of thirst," he grunted, grabbing the bucket and storming out. When he came back, she was sitting by the fire, looking sullen. But she had also baked biscuits, actual fluffy biscuits using his flour and baking soda, far better than the hardtack he usually made. He took a bite, and the taste was like a memory of a life he had forgotten. He looked at her. She was watching him anxiously. "It's good," he admitted, his voice low. A small, tentative smile broke across her face. It transformed her. For a moment, she wasn't the scared refugee. She was just a beautiful woman in a dimly lit cabin. Silas felt that ache in his chest again, stronger this time. He stood up abruptly. "I need to check the horses," he muttered, retreating to the safety of the cold. Out in the barn, leaning against the warm flank of his mare, Silas closed his eyes. He couldn't do this. He couldn't let her in. He was a man who brought bad luck to everyone he loved. His wife, Mary, had died in childbirth 10 years ago because he couldn't get the doctor in time. The guilt was a stone he carried every day. He had come to the mountains to suffer alone, not to play house with a runaway society girl. But when he went back inside and saw Eleanor sleeping in the chair, the firelight playing on her features, he knew he was in trouble. He wasn't just saving her from the cold anymore. He was protecting her. And the thought of Barton, this shadow from her past, coming to take her back, made a dark, dangerous rage boil in his gut. The thaw had begun outside, the snow melting in patches. But inside, the real thaw was happening in the frozen wasteland of Silas Blackwood's heart, and that scared him more than any blizzard. Weeks turned into a month. The harsh Montana winter had a way of distorting time, making days feel like years and weeks like mere moments. Eleanor, she had insisted he call her Ellie, was no longer the fragile doll he had pulled from the snow. Mountain air had put color back in her cheeks. She moved with more confidence now, her movements adapting to the confined space of cabin. She wore one of Silas's old flannel shirts, cinched at the waist with a rope, her delicate red coat folded away like a relic of a past life. She had learned to load the wood stove, to identify the cry of a hawk versus an eagle, and to tolerate Silas's long, brooding silences. But the silence between them was changing. It wasn't the awkward tension of strangers anymore. It was a companionable quiet. One evening, a heavy snow began to fall again. Silas was cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. Ellie was mending a tear in his wool blanket. "You never talk about your family," Ellie said softly, not looking up from her stitching. Silas's hand stopped on the barrel of the gun. "Nothing to talk about." "Everyone has something," she pressed gently. "You have a ring on the mantel, a gold band. It's dusty." Silas looked at the mantel. The ring sat there, a small circle of gold next to an old tin cup. "Belonged to my wife," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Mary." Ellie stopped sewing. She looked at him with profound sadness. "What happened to her?" "Died," Silas said flatly. 10 years ago. Winter much like this one. She went into labor early. I tried to ride for the dock in the valley, but the pass was blocked. By the time I got back, he didn't finish. He didn't have to." The heavy weight of the unspoken words filled the room. Ellie stood up and walked over to him. She did something brave then. She reached out and placed her hand over his, stopping his repetitive motion of polishing the gun. "It wasn't your fault, Silas," she whispered. "Wasn't it?" He looked at her, his eyes full of torment. "I brought her out here. I convinced her this life would be free. I killed her with my dreams." "You loved her," Ellie said firmly, "and she loved you. That isn't killing, that's living, even if it ends in pain." They stared at each other. The distance between them seemed to vanish. In the flickering firelight, Silas saw the strength in Ellie's eyes, a strength he had underestimated. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter. And for the first time in a decade, Silas felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't have to be alone. Maybe his penance was over. But the moment was shattered by a sound that made Silas's blood run cold. A howl, not the lonely call of a wolf. This was different. It was the baying of a hound, a tracking dog. Silas was on his feet instantly. Rifle snapped into readiness. He moved to the window, peering out through the crack and shutter. The snow was falling heavily, but he saw lanterns bobbing in the distance, down in the valley below the ridge. "What is it?" Ellie asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "Dogs," Silas said grimly. "And riders. 3 of them, maybe 4. Ellie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's him. It's Barton's men. He hired trackers. I told you he wouldn't stop." Silas turned to her. His face was a mask of focused intensity. "How much is this debt, Ellie?" "Thousands," she cried. "But it's not about the money anymore. It's about ownership. He thinks he owns me." Silas checked the load in his Winchester. He grabbed a box of ammunition from the shelf and shoved it into his pocket. "Nobody owns people. Not up here." "Silas, they'll kill you," Ellie pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Please, we have to run. We can go out the back way, up the goat trail." "In this snow?" Silas shook his head. "We'd freeze before morning. No, we hold our ground." He began to barricade the door. He overturned the heavy oak table, pushing it against the entrance. He handed Ellie a hunting knife. "If they get in," he said, looking her dead in the eye, "you go for the eyes or the throat, you understand?" Ellie took the knife, her hands shaking, but she nodded. "I understand." The lights drew closer. The barking grew louder. The sanctuary of the cabin, the warm bubble they had created, was about to be popped. Silas moved to the window, sliding the barrel of his rifle through the firing port he had cut into the logs years ago for bear defense. He watched the shadows emerge from the tree line. "Silas Blackwood!" a voice boomed from the darkness. It was a rough, city-accented voice. "We know you're in there, and we know you got the girl." Silas didn't answer. He just sighted down the barrel, aiming for the man holding the lantern. "Send her out and we leave you be," the voice shouted. "Keep her and we burn you out." Ellie was huddled in the corner, terrified. Silas looked back at her. He saw the woman who had made him biscuits. The woman who had told him his wife's death wasn't his fault. The woman who had made him feel like a man again, not just a ghost. "You want her?" Silas whispered to the empty air. "Come and take her." The storm outside was nothing compared to the violence that was about to unleash. The past had caught up with both of them. Ellie's demons were at the door, and Silas's need for redemption was about to be tested in lead and blood. The first shot shattered the glass of the small lantern hanging on the porch. The darkness was instant, followed by the deafening crack of a rifle echoing off the canyon walls. Silas didn't flinch. He squeezed the trigger. His Winchester barked, a flash of fire in the dark room. Outside, a man yelled in pain, followed by the frantic scrambling of horses. "Get down!" Silas roared at Ellie, though she was already pressed flat against the floorboards behind the overturned table. Bullets began to chew into the wood of the cabin. Thud, thud, splinter. The thick logs held, ancient pine absorbing the lead like a sponge, but the window shutter shattered, sending splinters flying across the room. "Spread out, circle the back," the voice commanded outside. It was the leader, a man who clearly knew his business. Silas moved. He was a whirlwind of calculated violence. He fired 2 shots from the front window, then ducked low and ran to the back of the cabin. There was no window there, only a small ventilation slat near the roof. He climbed onto a crate, peered out, and saw a shadow trying to creep up the blind side with a torch. Silas didn't have a shot. "Damn!" he hissed. He jumped down. "Ellie, listen to me. They're going to try to set the roof on fire. I have to go out." "No!" Ellie screamed, grabbing his leg. "You can't go out there." "If I stay, we burn," Silas said, his voice surprisingly calm. He grabbed his heavy coat and a second pistol, a rusty Colt Navy revolver he kept in a chest. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it unless you hear my voice. Exactly my voice." He looked at her one last time. In that look, there was a lifetime of apologies and promises. He touched her cheek with a rough finger. "I'll be right back." Silas slipped out a small side door he used for wood storage. It was low, hidden by a stack of logs. He crawled out into the snow, the cold biting at his face immediately. He was in the shadows, the wind masking his sound. He saw the man with the torch. He was close, preparing to throw the flaming brand onto the dry shingles of the roof. Silas rose from the snow like a yeti. He didn't fire. He lunged. He tackled the man, driving him into a snowbank. The torch hissed and went out. The man grunted, reaching for his knife, but Silas was stronger. A quick, brutal struggle ensued in the dark, ending with a sharp crack of a fist against a jaw. The man went limp. 1 down, 3 to go. But the commotion had given him away. "He's outside by the woodpile." Bullets kicked up snow around him. Silas rolled, scrambling for the cover of a large boulder. He was pinned down. He could hear them advancing. They were closing the net. Inside the cabin, Ellie gripped the knife. She heard the shouting, the gunfire. She felt utterly helpless. No, she thought, I am not helpless. I am not the victim anymore. She saw Silas's spare ammo box on the table. She saw the old double-barreled shotgun hanging above the mantel, the one Silas said kicked like a mule. She climbed up on a chair and pulled it down. It was heavy. She broke it open. It was loaded. Outside, Silas was in trouble. He had taken a grazing shot to his left arm. It burned like fire. He was reloading his Winchester with one hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. 2 men were flanking him. He could see their silhouettes against the snow. "Give it up, mountain man," the leader shouted. "We just want the girl. She's property." "She's a human being," Silas yelled back, popping up to fire. He missed. The men rushed him. Silas dropped the rifle and drew his Colt. Bang, bang. One man stumbled, clutching his leg, but the leader was right on top of him, a massive Bowie knife in his hand. Silas raised his arm to block, the knife slicing through his coat and into his forearm. He roared in pain, grappling with the man. They fell into the snow, rolling, a tangle of limbs in desperation. The leader was younger, stronger. He was forcing the knife down toward Silas's throat. Silas's strength was failing. The blood loss, the cold, the years of wear on his body, it was all catching up. He looked up at the night sky, thinking, "I'm sorry, Mary. I tried." Suddenly, the cabin door flew open. A boom like a cannon blast shook the night. Ellie stood in the doorway, the shotgun smoking in her hands. She hadn't hit anyone. The spread had gone wide. But the sheer noise and surprise froze everyone. "Get off him!" she screamed, racking the second hammer back with a click that sounded loud in the sudden silence. The leader looked up, distracted for a split second. That was all Silas needed. He bucked his hips, throwing the man off. He grabbed a rock from the ground and brought it down hard. The fight was over. The remaining man, the one with the leg wound, saw his boss down, and a crazy woman with a shotgun. He scrambled onto his horse. "I'm done. I'm done," he yelled, spurring the horse into the dark. Silas lay in the snow, panting, blood staining the white around him. Ellie dropped the gun and ran to him, falling into the snow beside him. "Silas, Silas," she was crying, tearing at her skirt to make a bandage. "I'm all right," he wheezed, though he clearly wasn't. He looked at her, his eyes shining with pride. You have a hell of a aim, Ellie." "I close my eyes," she sobbed, pressing the cloth to his arm. He laughed, a wet, painful sound. "Well, don't tell anyone that." The danger had passed, but the adrenaline was fading, leaving only the cold and the pain. They weren't out of the woods yet. Silas was hurt and the winter was far from over. But as Ellie helped him stand, supporting his weight, Silas realized something. He wasn't the one rescuing her anymore. She had just rescued him. The aftermath of the siege was a quiet, painful time. They dragged the unconscious men into the barn, tying them securely. Silas wasn't a killer if he didn't have to be, and he figured the sheriff in Echo Creek would want to have a word with Barton's hired thugs. Silas's arm was bad. The knife had gone deep, missing the artery but slicing muscle. Ellie stitched him up. Her hands, once soft and shaking, were now steady and covered in his blood. She bit her lip in concentration, the needle pulling the skin tight. Silas drank whiskey to numb the pain, watching her. You're a natural. He slurred slightly, the liquor hitting his empty stomach. I hate this, she said fiercely, tying off the knot. I hate that you got hurt because of me. I got hurt because I chose to fight, Silas corrected her. There's a difference. The next few weeks were a recovery of a different sort. The physical wounds healed, leaving new scars to join the old ones. But the emotional landscape of the cabin had shifted permanently. The barrier between them was gone. They were partners, survivors. Silas taught Ellie how to shoot properly, with her eyes open this time. She taught him how to read the books she had carried in her saddlebag, reading aloud to him in the evenings while the fire crackled. Shakespeare and poetry filled the air that used to hold only silence. One evening, as the first signs of spring began to show, the drip, drip, drip of melting icicles, Silas walked out to the porch. The air smelled of pine needles and wet earth. The mountains were waking up. Ellie followed him out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She stood beside him, looking out at the vast, rugged valley. The pass will be clear soon, Silas said quietly. He didn't look at her. Yes, Ellie replied. Her voice was tight. You can go back, Silas said. Not to St. Louis, but to a city. San Francisco, maybe. Somewhere safe. You're free now. Those men, they won't bother you again. I sent a telegram when I took them to town last week. Barton's been arrested for fraud. It was true. Silas had made the trek to Echo Creek with the prisoners while Ellie stayed safe. He had used his old contacts, men he hadn't spoken to in years, to ensure the law did its job. Ellie turned to face him. Is that what you want? For me to leave? Silas gripped the railing. His knuckles turned white. It's not about what I want, Ellie. It's about what you deserve. This life, it's hard. It's lonely. You belong in a world with soft beds and music and people. I had that world, Ellie said, stepping closer. And it was cold. Colder than this mountain ever was. I was alone in a room full of people. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. I never felt safe until I came here. Until I met you. Silas looked down at her. The rugged mountain man, the recluse, the ghost of Ironwood Ridge, crumbled. He took her hand in his rough palm encompassing hers. I'm a broken man, Ellie, he whispered. I've got nothing to offer but a drafty cabin and a hard life. You have everything I need, she said. She reached up and kissed him. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, tasting of coffee and hope. Silas froze for a moment, then he melted. He wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her close, burying his face in her hair. It was a kiss of redemption, a kiss that broke the chains of 10 years of guilt. Stay, he breathed against her ear. Stay with me. I'm not going anywhere, she promised. The sun began to crest over the peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. It was a new day. The winter was over. The silence of Ironwood Ridge was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of two hearts beating in rhythm, surviving the wilderness together. Silas Blackwood, the man who wanted to be alone, looked at the sunrise and realized he was finally, truly home. Wow, what a journey, folks. From the freezing depths of a blizzard to the warmth of a new beginning. Silas and Ellie's story is a reminder that even in the harshest winters of our lives, spring is just around the corner if we're brave enough to fight for it. I hope you felt the cold wind and the warmth of that fire. If this story touched your heart, if you cheered for Silas and Ellie, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It helps us share these stories with more people who need a little hope. And don't forget to subscribe to Frontier Rescue Stories. We have so many more tales of the Wild West, of love, survival, and courage waiting for you in our playlist. Go check them out right now. I want to hear from you. What did you think of Ellie's bravery with that shotgun? And what kind of story should we tell next? A sheriff seeking justice? A gold miner finding a lost child? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright and your hearts open. Stay safe, friends. This is Frontier Rescue Stories, signing off. Happy trails.